host, Renee Kranz. In studio with me today, again, is Father Andy Thuringer. Welcome, Father Andy.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yes, woohoo, you get to come back. He did so great the first time. We have him back. We wanted him to come back because first, you have been the speaker? Is it the speaker at Pious Pints? Is that what you would call yourself?
Yeah, I think so.
Presenter?
Yeah, presenter, speaker.
Yeah,
Doesn't,
yeah.
Yeah, so Pious Pints out in Hartford, there's this lovely little brewery called Buffalo Ridge. And I remember walking in there the first day, and they're always hosting community events and things.
Yeah.
And so I was like, the church needs to do something here. And I wanted to do like a little theology talk and then some fellowship, right?
Yeah.
And but I was like, I can't do it myself, right? And it can't all be on me. And then one of our parishioners came forward like a month into me being there and was like, I want to have theology talks at the brewery. And I was like, you're an answer to a prayer. So once a month, every Tuesday, the first Tuesday of every month, unless there's some crazy date or whatever. And we post everything in our bulletin and whatnot. But we do Pious Pints, where we bring in a speaker, talks for about a half an hour. We do some Q&A, and then we just hang out.
Yeah.
And we get anywhere from like 50 to like 125, I think was our biggest, people from Hartford and St. Michael's and Sioux Falls and just young people in the Catholic sphere in our diocese that show up to this every month, and it's so fun.
And this is not just for young people, correct? This is for anyone.
Oh my gosh, we run the gamut. Yeah, that's one of the coolest parts about it.
Yes, and I've actually, I know some people, all different ages that have been going. It's a little bit like a theology on tap.
A little bit. The one thing that we wanted to do different was sometimes theology on tap becomes Catholic Debate Club.
Oh, okay.
And instead we wanted it to be a place where we could celebrate our faith and talk about really cool parts of our faith that will probably never make it to a homily.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
That's kind of the vision and the goal behind it is to take some weird, obscure. I always think of my presentations as very clickbaity.
All right, I like this.
We want people to show up and we want them to have a good time, and we want to make it something where people could say like, trick their non-Catholic friend or their Catholic friend who's been away from Mass and be like, want to go to the pub on Tuesday? And they'll be like, yeah. And be like, great, my church is doing something, bye. And that they would actually still have a good time.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so part of the reason why we asked Father Andy to do this is because this is one of the talks he did at Pious Pints. It is about the Holy Land and the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, which most of us have never seen, never been to, may never see. But there's some things we don't know.
Well, and one of the things I think a lot of people probably wouldn't know off just on the surface, if I say Holy Sepulcher, like what are you talking about, right? Because it's a very old English word. It's even spelled with the R-E, Holy Sepulchre, right, or whatever. The British.
Or like, why is that spelled wrong?
Yes. So the Holy sepulcher just means tomb.
Okay.
And so the Church of the Holy Sepulcher is the church where Jesus's tomb, his empty tomb, is. Now, what's wild, and it seems too good to be true, but I promise you it's true, is that within the same church, only a couple hundred yards from each other, are both the tomb and Calvary, where Jesus died. They were actually geographically very close to one another.
Yeah.
And so it's all in the same building. So it's the Church of Calvary and of the Holy Sepulcher.
Yeah.
And so for us as Christians, Jesus' death and resurrection, that's the whole ballgame.
Yeah.
And so it's one of the most important churches in Christianity.
Yes, totally. So how did you come to know about this?
Well, the first thing that happened was I went to it.
Yeah.
The 2 years before I got ordained a priest, so the year before I got ordained a deacon, we were very blessed and we got to go and study for a month in the Holy Land.
Oh, wow.
And that's so beautiful, especially for men preparing to be priests, because they call the Holy Land the fifth gospel. There's something about being there that then when the gospels reference Capernaum or Bethsaida, or you know the geography, but you don't just know it, you've walked it and seen it, and you can tie things together a little bit better. So, we were going through all of these different places and learning about them, but something began to stick out to me that was really troubling to me, which was that when you go to a site, there is a range of how accurately we know that this is really where it happened. Right?
Okay.
There are some places where like, well, maybe this gospel story happened here, to we just made it up, we have no idea if it happened here, to this is actually the spot.
Okay.
Right? And there were places I would go, I got really frustrated at this because, for instance, we went to the baptismal site where Jesus was baptized in the Jordan.
Yep.
Right? Now the Jordan runs the length of Israel.
Okay.
Right? It goes north to south.
Right.
Right? And so it's like, how do you know that that's the spot?
Okay, so I didn't realize they don't really know the actual spot.
They say they do, right?
Okay.
But here's the other thing. In like the 60s, Israel dammed the Jordan for hydroelectric power.
Oh.
So today, if you pick the right spot of the Jordan, you can literally jump from one side to the other.
Right.
Now, it's very polluted, so I wouldn't recommend that. But because you might fall in. But in Jesus' day, it wasn't. And there are estimates that it was anywhere from like a couple hundred yards to like a mile or even wider at certain parts. And so we're sitting here and all my seminarian brothers are like kneeling down at this bank, and even some of them like dipping in little things to take horribly polluted holy water. And like, oh, this is the spot. And I was just angry because I was like, no, it could be 5 miles on either way on this river, and it's probably 200 yards that way.
Right.
You know? And that was really hard for me. I don't know why. There was something in my heart that just didn't. I came all this way, and you can't tell me where.
Right.
But there are a couple of places where we know exactly where different Bible stories happened.
Okay.
Capernaum, the hometown of Peter and Andrew.
Yep.
There are actually some pretty clear geographic things. We have Peter's house.
Oh.
We have the synagogue in Capernaum. When it says that all of the people gathered around Peter's house to be healed, Peter lived on the only major wide street in Capernaum. So you can actually stand in that street and be like, there was a big crowd here, right? And then there are places in Jerusalem when Jesus teaches on the Temple Mount, or he tips over the tables, or different things. Like, we can go to the Temple Mount. We don't know exactly where. And the Temple Mount is a couple football fields big.
Sure.
But you're like, here.
Yeah.
You know, like somewhere here.
Yeah.
But the most profound, and this is so beautiful, that the most important site in the Holy Land, right, where Jesus died and where he rose, I want you to listen to me carefully. We know. It's not speculation. It's not even an educated guess. We know that that's the tomb of Jesus. Even skeptical archaeologists can admit that that is the best place where we have any evidence, much less we have the best evidence, that is the empty tomb of Jesus. Now, they may argue why it's empty, right? That's a matter of faith. But that is the tomb of Jesus, and that is Calvary.
Okay.
And we know. And so when I went there finally, it was so powerful. And I'd like to talk about that in a little bit. Yeah. But probably first, the question is, how do you know?
Yeah. Well, that's what I was just going to ask you. Like, okay, you say they have archaeological proof, must be. Yeah. How do they know?
Yeah. So, first of all, we have to talk a little bit about the history of the Holy Land, right?
Okay.
One, when we talk about Jerusalem, where you'll find the tomb of the Holy Sepulcher today is actually smack dab in the middle of Jerusalem.
Okay.
Now, for any Bible scholars out there, you might see a problem with this, which is that they always crucified people outside the city gates. Right? And so there have been many Christians who've pointed to that and said, see, that church is in the middle of Jerusalem. It can't possibly be where Jesus really died and rose. And in fact, there was a devout Protestant man in the 1800s who was like, well, it has to be outside the city. And so he went and found a tomb outside the city and was like, this is it. And now a bunch of Protestants go over there. But the problem is that they're not being students of history when they do that.
Right.
Because Jerusalem at the time of Jesus was half as big as it was today. And just outside one of the city gates, what we know from archaeological studies underneath the Holy Land, or not underneath the Holy Land, underneath the Holy Sepulcher, is that whole area was a rock quarry.
Okay.
Now, why do you need a rock quarry right outside the city gate? Well, if you've ever seen pictures of the Wailing Wall, this gigantic retaining wall that the temple sat on top of, you'll know it's gigantic stones. You're not going to take those stones any farther than you have to. And so they had rock quarries all around the outside of the Holy Land. But what do you do with a rock quarry once you don't need the rocks from it anymore? You have this big stone pit right outside the city. Well, you know what you can also do outside the city besides crucifying people? You can bury people.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And why not use those nice stone rock walls that you know can be safely mined to make tombs, right? And then you can beautify it a little bit, make it a garden. It becomes this beautiful place, right? And so what we know just from excavating the site is the Mount of Calvary was not like a mile-high mountain or something, right?
Yep.
The Mount of Calvary was just outside the city gate. There was a slight hill, probably only 20 or 30 feet, but it sat at the edge of the rock quarry. So you could be above the rock quarry and it would just look like it kind of elevates a little bit. But if you were in the rock quarry, you know,
it'd be high.
hundreds of feet high.
Right.
And then there was an active cemetery at the time of Jesus. And we found many tombs in that region, not just the one that we pinpoint. Right. So anyway, this was a plausible place for all of this to take place. Why do we know that that's Jesus' tomb?
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of
that's
the whole
a big
ballgame,
question.
Right. So if we go through the history of the Holy Land a little bit, Jesus dies, rises, ascends around 33 AD, and the Christian movement really hits its stride around 50 and onwards. In 70 AD, just as Jesus prophesied, the Jews rose up against the Romans and were utterly crushed, and they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, right? Now, after that, Jewish and Roman relations were very poor for many decades.
I imagine so.
And by the year 135, a new emperor comes to power whose name is Hadrian. I don't know if you ever heard of Hadrian's Wall in England, right? And Hadrian is a massive construction project emperor. He likes to build things for his glory. And so what Hadrian decides, he's had enough of these pesky Jews, and he writes an edict declaring that all Jews must be expelled from Jerusalem, and that he's going to remake it as a purely Roman city. He's going to rename it the Aelia Capitolina, which in Latin just means the Holy City, and it's going to be a place for Roman temples, right? And what he does is he takes the outer wall and turns it into the main highway that's running down the street. So now what used to be the outer boundary is smack dab in the city, and then Hadrian doubles the size of the rest of Jerusalem. So what was just outside the city gates is now right in the middle. But his generals, who are, because he didn't go all the way to the Holy Land to do this, right? His generals who are writing back have all sorts of problems, construction, there's an uprising. And we have some of these letters. And one of the things that they report is, hey, we have a question. There's this really pesky group of people. They're not Jews. All right. We know they're not Jews because the Jews hate them and won't let them worship with them. They kick them out of the synagogues. They beat them, right? These are no friends of the Jews. But they're also not pagans, and they still worship one God, but not quite the way the Jews do. And anyway, don't worry, they're not trying to rebuild the temple or anything, but they have this one spot in the middle of the city that they really love. It's like this old hill in this rock quarry, and they're just there all the time. What do you want us to do about this? Right? And obviously, those were the early Christians, and they were visiting the tomb and the site of Calvary, right? As the city is being built up around it, right? So what Hadrian writes back and says is, this still sounds too Jewish for me. We need to expel them. But some of them are Roman citizens, so we can't expel them. So we need to discourage them from coming and praying where they like to pray. So what he does is he has them fill in that rock quarry. And on top of that rock quarry, they build a temple to Zeus. And then there's this one hill that they really like to pray at. And that hill still sticks up. Even when they fill it in, this hill still sticks up. So he builds a statue of Minerva over that. So he has a god over the pit where they like to be, and a statue over the hill of a goddess where they like to be. Now, on the one hand, this is a sacrilege. And I'm sure the Christians were heartbroken to see their holy place where their God died and rose, right now being blasphemed. On the other hand, it inadvertently preserved the site and marked it perfectly.
Yes.
And so for the next couple hundred years, when Christians come to the Holy Land to see these sites and they meet the local Christian community that's underground, and they say, take me to the place where Jesus died and rose. And they go and they say, you see that temple? Under that is where Jesus was buried. Do you see that statue? That's Calvary, the plinth that it's sitting on, right? And so this gets passed along again and again and again by Christians until the year 325.
Okay.
In the year 313, Constantine legalizes Christianity, right, with the Edict of Milan. And as he legalizes Christianity, Rome has to get its bearings. He writes a big blank check to the Christian community and says, build me a church just inside the city of Rome. Let's not push the envelope too far, but build a Christian church. And that's the Church of St. John Lateran today. At the time, it was called Jesus Christus Salvador, Jesus Christ the Savior. So that's the first legal Christian church in the Roman Empire. But it doesn't take long for him to say, we need to go to the Holy Land. And his mother, Helena, takes this on. And I don't even know how old she was at the time, but she couldn't have been a spring chicken, right? Yet is willing to travel all of this distance from the Roman Empire to the Holy Land. And Constantine gives her an edict to build 3 churches. One where Jesus was born, one where he ascended into heaven, and one where he died and rose. And so Helena gets there. She gets on the ground. And now the Christians are free to practice wherever they want, right? And to do whatever they want. And so she goes to the Christian community and says, where did the Lord die and where was he buried and rose?
Right.
And they're able to say, see that big temple?
Yep.
See that statue? Right under there. And so they mount this massive excavation project. And what do they find? They find an empty tomb with a bunch of filled tombs, but they find an empty tomb. And then they find under the statue of Minerva, this small hill.
Right.
Right. And she begins to make this massive basilica. And the way the basilica worked is it had an outer courtyard that went right up to that main road, kind of a meeting place. That was where they had coffee and donuts, I bet, right?
Yeah.
And then you went into the main church, a giant basilica, think St. Peter's Square. Or not St. Peter's Square, but St. Peter's Basilica, right? And you'd go in and go up to the, that was where they had mass and everything. But if you wanted to visit the sites, you actually went out the back door.
Okay.
And there what they did was they chiseled around Calvary to make it look a little bit more like a mountain. To make it even a little taller. Yep. And then they put wrought iron bars around it, right? So that you could get up almost like a zoo and you could see it and maybe even touch it, but you couldn't like climb it or anything like that. Yeah. And they planted a crucifix or a cross on top of Calvary, right? And by the way, this church lasted for centuries, and we have ancient paintings and mosaics of Calvary in this setting. We know what it looked like based on artists' renditions who went to the Holy Land and saw this. And then that was in its kind of own little courtyard.
Yeah.
And then if you continued on the courtyard, you went into a building they called the Archeological, which it's a rotunda, a big round building. And what they did was when they found the tomb of Jesus, they carved around it totally and removed an entire layer of rock so that what was just a hole in a wall became a freestanding building. And then they built a small building around that. Okay. Right? And so Christians could literally go into the tomb. Now, it didn't look like a tomb anymore. Right. And if you ever go to the Holy Sepulcher today, it doesn't look like that church.
Right. Right.
That church has gone through a ton of different changes. In fact, when you go, it kind of looks like a mess. Yeah. It doesn't look like a church. You go down all these twisting, winding roads. And you show up and it's just like this side of a building with an off-center door to walk into. And then it's turn left for Calvary and you go up some steps and turn right for the Holy Sepulcher. And it doesn't look like a tomb. It looks like a little church. Yeah. Right? And so many Christians, and I understand why, show up to the Holy Sepulcher and they're like, this doesn't look like a tomb. Yeah. This doesn't look like Calvary. This doesn't even really look like a church. Right. What's going on here? And so if I can just run through, how did we get from the beautiful Constantine Basilica to the slightly hodgepodgey mess that we have today? Because here's the thing, and this is important. We know that the early Christians knew exactly where Jesus died and rose. Right. And if we kept constant track of that throughout the centuries and we never lost sight of where it went, then we can still know. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so here's the thing. So just let me run down some dates. Yes. In 614, Jerusalem is destroyed and taken over by the Persians. But they allow the Christians to continue to have their holy sites. And so Christians are still able to be there. Right. Then in 637, Jerusalem is captured by Muslims. But Christian sites are again spared. And so the Holy Sepulcher, Constantine's Basilica, still remains. Right. Then in 1009, another era, a new caliph of the Muslim order came to power, and they destroyed holy Christian sites. In fact, they purposely hacked away the top layer of Calvary, and they hacked away the roof of the Holy Sepulcher. Okay. But they couldn't destroy it all. I mean, it's solid stone. Right. Right? And then the First Crusade comes and liberates the Holy Land. And so in 1048, the church is rebuilt, but obviously it's rebuilt after a war when the Christians are just newly taking it over. And so it's not nearly as grand. Right. Then in 1099, Then in 1099, there's another crusade, and so we lose it and gain it again, and there was more damage to the church. And then in 1808, the church burned down and had to be rebuilt, right? And so it's been through multiple wars, fires, construction projects, all this stuff. And the giant church that Constantine had, little by little, in these construction projects, has gotten smaller and smaller, and no longer has the grand, church-looking part of it. Yeah. But those sites have been maintained and never been lost. And even a couple of years ago, they had to, the Archeological, the little room that they built around the tomb to protect it, was it was so old it was starting to fall apart and lean, and they knew they had to fix it. And so they went through and brought in all these archaeologists, and they had a year to rebuild it, but also as long as you're going to take off the protective coating, do some studies, right?
Yes, for sure.
And they did all of these studies of the ground underneath it as best they could. There was actually a tunnel running underneath the Holy Sepulcher, not connected to the tomb in any way, but it seems like it was almost like drainage for construction.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating that we never knew it was there. We were able to, but it was all like accurate according to, and they even took off the main slab of the Holy Sepulcher itself. And what they found was the limestone that is exactly what you would expect from a first century tomb.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so everything that they were able to study, of course, they're not able to study everything, but fit that this is the original location. Yeah. And was all kind of newly reconfirmed just a few years ago. So unless you want to be the most uber skeptic in the world,
would have to.
This is the spot.
Yeah.
And what that means is when you go there, you are at the place where Christ died on the cross. And you are in the tomb, which is now empty, but at one point in time had his body in it. Yeah. When I got to go, we were very blessed. And we got locked in the Holy Sepulcher overnight.
Oh, darn.
We got special permission.
And
okay. They kicked out everybody else, and they locked us in, and we were basically there from like 5 in the evening till 8 in the morning.
Wow.
And we just got the place to ourselves, us and maybe 10 other people. And so we each got like 10, 15 minutes to pray alone in the empty tomb.
That's incredible.
And I mentioned earlier that I was like really frustrated by all of this, right? By how much we didn't know and how many of these sites were kind of like iffy, right? Yeah. But I knew that this site was accurate. And so I'm in there praying, and still I was upset, right? It still wasn't enough. And I was like, God, what's going on here? Why am I in such a bad mood? Yeah. This is such a gift, And then it hit me that when I went to the Holy Land, deep down, even if I wouldn't admit it to myself, what I really wanted was to like turn the corner and bump into Jesus, right? And then I could grab him and be like, let's have a coffee, But he wasn't there. And I looked up at that moment, and there was a candelabra sitting on the tomb, massive golden thing. And in Latin it said, surrexit, non est hic, which is what the angel said to the first visitors to the tomb. Surrexit, he is risen. Non est hic, he's not here. Yep. And all of a sudden I realized, like, that's the whole point of our faith, is that by every right, everything I know about the natural world means that there should be a body here. And there's not. Yeah. And I began to, like, tremble. And it was such this gift of, like, just how powerful the resurrection is. And that it's not a fairy tale. It happened in a particular place. And if you're blessed enough, like one day, I hope you all get to join it, to go there. But even if you can't, right? We can't encounter Jesus. Like, we're not going to bump into him at Coffee and Donuts. And that's the whole point. Yeah. He's not here anymore. He rose from the dead and ascended to the Father. And now we get to meet him in the church, in the sacraments, in the scriptures, in all the ways he comes to us by the power of the Holy Spirit. Yeah. But I just think the church is so cool. It's cool that it's real and that we can like prove it historically, and that the tomb is empty. Yeah. Praise God.
Yeah. That is fascinating. A fascinating encounter you had, and just going through all of the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. I'm actually wondering what's underneath all of that right now. Like, what's under, like, the stuff we don't know, like what's underneath. I feel like there's a lot more we don't know.
I mean, they've done excavations, and mostly what it is other tombs. Yeah. They have some other tombs on display still that are still open, that you can go. They've been emptied since then. Yes. But they weren't originally empty when they found them. But I can't remember her name right now. I don't want to misquote it, but there's a very famous archaeologist who was like pioneer in biblical studies, who was given basically full access under the Holy Sepulcher. And it's period appropriate. It's exactly what we would expect from the time.
That's awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for all of that. If you enjoyed hearing about that kind of stuff, go to Pious Pints on a Tuesday at the beginning of the month in Hartford. If you go to St. George's website, I'm sure you could look up the bulletin and find the information there. They'll talk about things like that, all kinds of topics. I know there's one coming up on the faith and science.
Yeah, I'm doing one in April. I don't know when this podcast will release, but I'm doing one in April on what happens when it seems like the Bible and science contradict one another. Yes. How do we wrestle with that?
Yeah, so there'll be all kinds of topics that if you are interested, I would encourage you to go. It might be Father Andy, it might be someone else, but they have really good stuff there. So thank you, Father, for being with us again. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome.
Thanks. All right, if you haven't found us yet on social media, you can find us at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at SF Diocese. That's it for us today. Hope you'll join us again next week for more Catholic Views.